Hi, my name's Kiefer. Welcome back to Pangean Illustration. So, what are we doing today? You've seen the thumbnail, you've seen the title. We are doing round 3 of drawing Pokemon as FNAF style animatronics. Gotta admit, getting to the end of the pre-drawn images, so soon you will be seeing some original drawings, but for now, just enjoy the story and enjoy Night 2, Part 2, Five Nights at the Pokerplex. Barkley steadied his breathing and trod gently as he followed the hulking frame of the rhinoceros animatronic into the bowels of the Pokerplex. It was a twisted maze of varying corridors and rooms that appeared to shift and distort, growing darker and more enclosed the further you traversed. But he needed to find out what was going on in this sick and twisted location. He watched the machine closely, for any sign of danger, analysing every component of the entity for even the slightest sign that it would turn around. If he saw the slightest twitch of a finger, he was careful to duck behind the nearest corner or cabinet. Not only this, but he kept a close eye on the writhing mass of wires and pink metal that was drooping from its arms. What remained of the balloon animatronic was clearly in pain and was making enough noise to wake the dead. It was an eerie shrieking that bounced against the walls and echoed all through the facility, and was significantly more unnerving than the haunting song it had been singing earlier that night. As he followed the machine, they passed countless rooms filled to the brim with blueprints and prototypes of varying shapes and sizes. The concerning thing, however, was that not all of them appeared to be as jovial or as child-friendly as the animatronics upstairs. Amongst the varying pieces of animatronic hardware, the faceplates and endoskeletons were military-grade plans for weaponry and mechanical augments, for a series of mechanical soldiers that would make man obsolete. What he saw was both terrifying for the implications that it could pose, but fascinating to him because of what he could produce with the technology. Other rooms, however, were filled with more of the monstrosities similar to those on the upper levels, except they didn't all seem to be functional, and many seemed to be in varying stages of being repaired. Some of them even appeared like they had little chance of being repaired at all. Again, Barkley found himself fascinated by it all. It's like the basement of this place is some kind of hospital. It's unlike anything I have seen in spectral behaviour. Has that animatronic been brought down here to be fixed too? He stared at the rhino animatronic yet again, but had almost begun to feel guilty for the pain that the machines must have been feeling. With every step, he felt himself growing slower, mind trapped in the thought that he had been harming these machines, that just wanted to live as normal a life as they could. It didn't matter that it was in self-defense. In many of the instances he had just seen them as monsters, but he was being reminded of the vague humanity these entities had, and why he was on this mission in the first place, to help any spectrals he could, even if it was against agency policy. He stopped, slumped over, dwelling on his past actions. He snapped back into the moment, as he heard a metallic creaking from the door he had stopped at. He looked back towards the rhino. It hadn't stopped to see what made the noise, meaning he was in the clear. While hesitant, Barkley crouched down below the window of the door, and slowly lifted his head until the bottom of his eyes rested above the frame, and the dim light from inside illuminated his forehead. Inside the room was what appeared to be a husk of an animatronic, and while it was battered and beaten, it appeared to have a newer frame, and was more advanced than many of the others he had came into contact with. The machine itself was loosely based on a pig, but was themed to appear more dark and gothic. Its plating was primarily grey, but had sections of pink, purple and yellow to break apart the dark aesthetic. It was a bulkier animatronic, not as big as the rhino, but just as menacing. It was hung on 2 pegs protruding from the wall, one under each arm, keeping it suspended. The plates on its stomach were open, revealing a complex mass of wires and hydraulics, but it appeared to be out of operation. He breathed a sigh of relief, fogging up the glass. Then he heard another creak of metal, and a glowing red light blared through the steam. He wiped away the condensation to see it staring. The animatronic writhed and rattled, it shook and twitched back into life, but its left arm remained limp and lifeless even as it struggled, attempting to push itself away from the wall with its huge pink hooves and remaining right arm. Inch by inch, it dragged itself across the pegs and released itself from the wall. It landed with a clank on its hands and knees, but was pushing up from the concrete, slowly getting back to its feet, again cracking and popping as it raised up like a zombie from the grave. When it was stood, it leaned forward, releasing a deathly mechanical screech that shook the ground, before running towards the door, one foot dragging its heel that had snapped in the fall. Barkley took a step back, almost falling backwards as the pig animatronic began pounding the door, smashing the window, glass shattering onto his face, cutting the soft skin of his cheek. It snapped its jaw and screeched through the open space where the window had been, but the steel door held strong, keeping the machine locked inside. It eventually stepped away from the door, walking back towards where the pegs had been. Again, Barkley breathed a sigh of relief, until he heard stomping from behind the door, growing louder and faster. He dived out the way, ducking as the door flew across the hallway, thrown off its hinges into the wall on the opposite side. The pig had thrown itself against it, bending the steel door and snapping the hinges, unlocking it from its concrete frame. Not a moment later, Barkley was on his feet, not giving it time to get up, and ran further into the darkness of the corridors. A few doors down, he began to notice there wasn't the similar pounding of metal feet on concrete, even though he should have been catching up to the rhino. Either the machine had picked up speed since he had been following it, or it had stopped for some reason. He slowed his pace and peered around the corner in the direction the rhino would have been heading. It was there, back turned to him, but crouching down with the balloon animatronic still in its arms. Gently it released its fellow machine to the ground, before slowly turning around, lumbering, arms down at its side, before walking back in the direction of the operative. Barkley couldn't be found or he wouldn't have another chance to see the facility. He turned and ran for the nearest door he could. He opened, ran inside and tried to close it as slowly and quietly as possible, but the clink of the handle locking into place sounded like thunder against the otherwise silent room. He hid behind one of the many endoskeletons that were stood motionless, hopefully lifeless. He crouched down, shrouded by the metal bars that formed a skeleton, looking towards the door, and the two windows that were built on either side. He began to whisper to himself. Okay, my best bet is to keep an eye on the window. As soon as it passes the first, I'll know it's after me. If it goes past the first and doesn't appear in the second window, it knows I'm in here. If it goes past the second window, it's going towards the pig. Likely to shut it up. God, why did I get myself into this mess? He waited, and the rhino walked past the first window. It took a moment, and Barkley began to hold his breath as he saw the handle of the door rattling, but then it continued past the second, towards where the pig had been. Barkley crawled out from hiding and whispered again. At least some of you machines are good for something. Thanks for the assist. He sniggered as he said it, but then stood upright, stretching and cracking his back. He tapped the endoskeleton on the shoulder, and it shook, not having the weight of the other animatronics through lack of plating. Noticing a sheet of paper stuck to his foot, he leaned on the machine further, using his other hand to peel the document from his foot. It was a blueprint for a new type of endoskeleton, one that was lighter and more flexible than those in the room. He could see that the idea was to give them shifting components that would allow the endo to be as large or as small as it needed to be used in multiple animatronics. What was scary about this was that the blueprint also had an image of the endo being used inside of a human body, in place of a skeleton. Whereas the other blueprints he had seen had been inspiring, this was dark even for him. He began to pull his hand away from the endo when the bite of cold steel wrapped around his wrist. He pulled away again, assuming it was just the machine locking up, but as he stared at the endo's head, there was that all too familiar sound of creaking metal. He panicked, attempting to pull his arm away to no avail. It ripped his shirt and tore a gash into his arm, but he had pried it free. He kicked it away, leaving it to fall on the ground, but realised that was the worst thing he could have done, and he heard the rhino's footsteps closing up on his location once more. He ducked as low as he could, hoping not to be seen by the rhino, but noticed there was a door into the next room that he could use if things didn't go to plan. He waited again, hoping the machine would just walk past again, but it walked past the first window, this time looking right into the room, and began rattling the door harder than it had previously. Barkley shot for the door, not caring about noise this time, and let it hit the wall with a slam. As he stepped through, he stared back at the other door. Its handle and bolts had fallen to the ground, followed by the door itself, which fell into the room, spraying dust up into the air. He continued, though, pulling the door closed behind him as the rhino stepped into the other room. Luckily, it hadn't seen through the dust as the door clicked back into place. To prevent the same thing from happening, Barkley slid across a cabinet in the way of the door and jammed 2 brooms into the handle. Realistically, it wouldn't have been enough to stop the machine, but it would at least hinder it from getting into the space as easily. Barkley closed his eyes, heart racing, and slid his back down the flat side of the cabinet, now leaning, tired, against it and the floor. He didn't even see where he was, but didn't care as long as he was able to get away undetected. When he opened his eyes again, he was shocked. His face turned pure white, and fear began to overtake him. What he was looking at was absolutely horrific. A room full of bodies of people who had gone missing from the surrounding area. Ex-security guards, intruders, guests, and even the bodies of children were visible amongst the piles of dead and decayed. But still, Barkley leaned in for a closer look. Each body was at a different stage of decomposition. Some were missing limbs, and others had barely begun the process. But all had been experimented on. He twisted a lens at the side of his watch in preparation to record his findings. Each was different, but the intention was clear. Based on the blueprints he had found in the other room, Barkley realised that they had already begun testing to replace the skeleton with an endo of their design. But they were trying it with varying different models of the same endoskeleton. He saw how some of the bodies had been skinned, others still had their skin but it was stitched up and broken. Others, the endoskeleton was too large for the body and broke through the skin. But this wasn't all that there was. Based on the level of decomposition, Barkley was able to figure out that the original plans were to replace body parts with that of animatronic limbs. There was one in particular where the body had decomposed completely, but there was an animatronic bird claw replacing an arm. Whether they had been alive at the time of the procedure was uncertain, but many of the bodies had similar augments to this. Then he saw a body that stood out from the rest. They were skinned, had an endoskeleton embedded into them, but had also been jammed into the plating of an animatronic suit. The only reason he could tell it wasn't just an animatronic was because its skinless, muscular face was showing, and a bare faceplate had fallen off over time. It then clicked what they were attempting to do, based on how many of the animatronics there were. He took the rest of the photos he needed and proceeded to leave the room. He couldn't stand the stench of decay any longer and threw up on entering the slightly fresher air in the corridor. The door he exited from, surprisingly, had led to the opposite side of where he had seen the rhino place the balloon animatronic. And luckily for him, the machine had been moved. The rhino had already been back this way. He continued and caught up to where the rhino was, still putting the pieces together in his head about the end goal and plot of this, what was essentially a factory. They moved at a steady pace, Barkley avoiding any noise and refusing to look in any more rooms. He continued to watch the rhino, again paying attention to even the slightest twitch of a finger. At this point he had had enough. It was only his second night, and he had more than enough evidence to prove that this place had to be shut down, and all animatronics here would need to be placed under agency custody, where they could hopefully help them at the animatronic village. He clenched his fist tightly, and began to bite his lip in anticipation that he would be able to put an end to this tonight, but still held back from running ahead of the animatronic and blowing his cover. He suddenly began to feel a warmth blowing through the corridor, and the darkness began to fade into a bright orange light. It was dim, but was growing in abundance ahead of the rhino. The colours of the animatronic began to fade to black, and its form became a silhouette as it continued forward. They entered a room full of smelting buckets and furnaces. The warmth was coming from the creation of molten metal, and the light was the flames. Everything appeared like a silhouette, making it hard for Barkley to see. But when he could make it out, he saw the silhouette of a man talking to the rhino animatronic before pointing it in the direction of the nearest pool of molten metal. Barkley looked on, but still didn't want to reveal his location, even as the rhino walked up the steps to the pool's ledge and threw the balloon animatronic into the flames. The screams were unbearable. It shrieked and roared before the sounds were drowned out by the glugging of the molten metal entering the entity's body. Barkley's eyes widened and he breathed sharply, wondering if he had caused that. "Why don't you come out of the shadows, security guard?" "How did you know I was there?" Barkley answered, his voice cold and his emotions racing. "Just because you didn't know I was here doesn't mean I didn't know about you. And it's easy to figure out when someone has destroyed an animatronic for the sole purpose of finding out where they go. This has happened before." The shadowed figure answered, his silhouette dancing with the flames behind him, and a pair of glasses glinting in the firelight. "Was there any need to destroy the animatronic? It could have been fixed up. It could have been put back out there. Who is going to give the children their balloons now? I thought you would have been happy to see the end of her. I already brought her back from the dead once, and with her second chance she tried to kill you. Besides, I'm quite happy to get rid of the security guard you replaced." Wait, what? Barkley was struck by what he had said, and it seemed to have fitted together the final piece of the puzzle. He let a tear fall down his cheek and then spoke again. "Let's see if I have this right. You've been allowing these animatronics to kill people with the sole purpose that you get to bring them back as more animatronics? What exactly do you think you are doing, and are you trying to help people, or are you just sick? Why do you keep calling them animatronics? They aren't that. They're people reincarnated, given a second chance at life. Don't you want to be one of them? I'm telling you now, that is not what's happening. You haven't saved anyone and you are hurting so many more beings than you even realise. Just stop now." The man sighed and stood in front of the flames. He took a few steps forward, still hiding his face from view. "Just call me the engineer, because I have created the cure to death, and I can give that to people or take it away from them. I don't care who I hurt. Those bodies you have seen are failed experiments. Nothing more and nothing less, and you are going to be one of them if you aren't careful. I don't know what your name is or who you think you are, but you are not above me, for I am God. You really are pathetic, aren't you? You haven't brought people back to life, and I can't wait for you to figure out why these animatronics are alive, but I'm not going to tell you. Good luck with everything, because you're not a god, just a demon in human flesh." He turned around and began walking towards the corridor where he had entered the room. The engineer turned and walked towards a large tarp that was covering multiple objects. He walked towards it and let out a laugh. "Do you really think I'm letting you walk out of here alive? You're calling me pathetic and you don't even realise what you've got into." He pulled the tarp to reveal 3 freestanding animatronics. One was primarily green and white, resembling a cat with a leafy mask. Another was blue, resembling a humanoid peacock dressed to look like it was going to a disco. And the last, the most terrifying of the 3, was bright red, yellow and white, appearing like a fire-breathing crocodilian. He turned each of them on, and they instantly ran towards Barkley. The cat and peacock animatronics were slow, but the crocodile ran ahead and stopped ahead of Barkley, stopping him from leaving. It clawed and snapped at him, barely missing flesh and tearing a gash into his shirt. It leaned back before thrusting forward and releasing a stream of flames from its open maw. Barkley ducked under, leaving the cat and peacock animatronics, who had just reached him, to get singed. Their paintwork melted, and the fabric burning away to ashes. These animatronics didn't scream, but continued to walk forward as their bodies broke apart from the heat. He could just see the silhouette of the pig animatronic entering the room, so he ducked to the side and left it to tear at the crocodilian's plating. It wasn't long before the rhinoceros animatronic decided to get involved, seeing what was happening, but the pig threw the crocodile across the room and into the rhino. The crocodilian landed on the floor, scrambling to get back up, but the rhino slid back, losing its footing and landing in the pool of molten metal. It did manage to pull itself back up, but lost both legs, leaving it to crawl along the ground before collapsing, unconscious. Balky was invested in the chaos, desperate to see the engineer put in his place, but he soon realised that he needed to get out of the basement before the building was open to the public again. He left the animatronics to fight, but caught the sight of the engineer sneaking off into the shadows of the room. He wanted to chase after him desperately, but decided it was a job for another day. At least he had taken a large number of the threats off the board, and he now had more of an understanding of what was at stake if he didn't complete the mission. He ran up through the corridors and up the stairs to the foyer, where he could still see the shattered glass and popped balloons from earlier that night. He grabbed his belongings from the office and watched as the animatronics all returned to their proper locations. Why do they do that? There's got to be a reason why they stop roaming freely in the day, but that's a question I'll have to answer in the next few nights. He unlocked the chains to the door and left the building. Only 3 more nights until the auction. So, that's part 3. Technically still night 2, but there you go. I wanted to stretch night 2 out a bit because it just didn't feel right after the last part to skip to night 3. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed the story and the art in this episode. And please, tell me in the comments what you think. Liking, commenting, and subscribing will help massively. But honestly, I just enjoy writing the stories, so don't even worry about it. See you next time. Bye.